Well, today we're going to be in the book of Hebrews. We're going to start in the end of chapter 4 and cross on into chapter 5. So if you want to go ahead and turn there today, we're going to talk about the greater high priest. Now let me start out by reading a little bit in the book of Hebrews chapter 14. So I'll give you just a minute to turn there. Hebrews chapter 14, Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14. So if you'll turn to Hebrews chapter 4. And starting in verse 14, it says this: "Seeing then that we have a great high priest that has passed into the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our profession. For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." You see, the book of Hebrews starts out and takes the time to show us the superiority of Christ. We've touched on some of these things in some of the previous lessons. In chapter 1, it revealed that Christ was greater than the angels and greater than any prophets. In chapter 2, it reveals that he's greater than any man. In chapter 3, greater than Moses and his law, and provides us a greater rest than the Israelites had ever had in the promised land. And now in chapters 4 and 5, it reveals him as the greater high priest. Yeah. Now when you think of the word priest, we don't throw that word around in this church very often, but when you think of the word priest, what do you picture? You know, chances are you can picture a certain kind of clothing, or there's probably some truth in the expression, that clothes make the man. If you think of a police officer, a fireman, a soldier, or a ball player, all of them have their own uniform that you picture them in. And a lot of times when we think of a priest, not to be the same as a pastor or a preacher, but a priest, the image comes to mind, may depend on what last movie or television show you might have seen. You might, if you saw something back in the older days, back in Europe, you might picture what these men before the Reformation arrayed in all kinds of ostentatious splendor. Or if you think about in a modern day society, a lot of times when people in our world think of a priest, they think of the little white collar that the Catholic priests wear. That's what they imagine. But when you read the book of Hebrews, you have to understand that's not at all what the Jewish Christian would have pictured when they heard the word priest. They had a very different picture in mind of what a priest was and what a priest should do. They would have pictured the man dressed in a white linen robe with a robe of deep blue over it. This priest would have a breastplate with 12 stones on it and a golden frontlet. They would picture the high priest who was allowed to enter into the Holy of Holies in the temple. Only the high priest was allowed to go past that curtain and make sacrifices for the sins of the nation on the Day of Atonement. And only the high priest could go before God as the people's representative. See, only the high priest could offer sacrifices as payment for the nation's sins. And this is what the Jewish people had in mind when they heard the word a high priest. If you were a Jew, you looked to the high priest to make intercession for your sins. That was where you put your hope for your salvation, in the high priest. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus Christ is now the one and only high priest for all the world. We're going to look in Hebrews 4 and 5, and we're going to see why Jesus is the greater high priest. First of all, Jesus was a sympathetic priest. Hebrews 4 and 15, again, let me read verse 15 again. "For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." He's sympathetic. You see, the Jewish people wanted a sympathetic priest. They didn't always get one, but that's what they wanted. In fact, the high priest during Jesus' day was more of an embarrassment than a sympathetic priest. Annas had been the high priest, but he had kind of let his son-in-law take over, Caiaphas, kind of fill in for him, so to speak, and take over some of the duties of the high priest. We know that, what do we know about Caiaphas? Well, we learned about Caiaphas because he plays a central part in the plot to have Jesus put to death. And that's Caiaphas, but Annas was really not much greater than Caiaphas. Annas, how did he even get his power? He got his power by making compromises with Rome against his own people. He got his wealth by turning the temple into a shopping mall. You know, he had set up all kinds of tables and sold merchandise to the worshipers. These are the very tables that Christ came in and overturned and scattered them and threw them out. You know, the point is that neither of these men, Annas or Caiaphas, had much sympathy for the people. All they really cared about was maintaining their power, maintaining their wealth. So when we look at what the Jewish people had in comparison to Jesus Christ, there really just is no comparison. Jesus Christ is the exact opposite of one who only seeks power and wealth. In fact, he had all the power and all the wealth he could ever need or imagine in heaven, and he put that down and decided to come live among the humans as a human. And Hebrews 5, as we start in there, describes, first of all, it starts out by describing the qualities of this new high priest. Verse 2 says this: "Who can have compassion on the ignorant, and on them that are out of the way, for that he himself also is compassed with infirmity." You see, this original Greek word that we use for compassion, that's metriopaio, which literally means being in the middle of anger and apathy. Think about what that really means. What does it mean to be between anger and apathy? Well, how do we react when someone ignorant does something wrong or something stupid that affects us? Well, it's very common for us to get angry with that person when they've done something like that. And if we don't get angry when someone ignorant does something stupid, it usually means we really just don't care, and then we have apathy. So we either get angry because we care too much, or we have apathy because we don't care enough. In the middle is compassion. We care, but we don't let it get us angry. That's compassion. That's what it's talking about here. The high priest is supposed to have compassion. Jesus, our true high priest, he's not indifferent to moral lapses, but he's not harsh with them either. He's able to take this position only because he shares himself. And he shared himself in a human stance, and he was able to take on all of our weaknesses as a human being, but yet sin not. He had the same desires that we had, the same fleshly feelings that flow within our body were in his body, but he was able to live his life without sin anyways. So that way he identifies with us and has compassion for us. Not only is he a sympathetic priest, but he's an appointed priest. Hebrews 5:4 says that Jesus is appointed. Here in verse 4 it says, "And no man taketh this honor unto himself, but he that is called of God, as was Aaron." Christ had to be appointed to the position of high priest. You know, it may seem not as important to us because we're not used to that. We're not in the position of having a priest preside over us, but to the Jew it meant a lot. It meant a lot that this man was called and appointed of God. You see, the reason Hebrews is called Hebrews because it was written to the Hebrews, which are the Jews. And all Hebrews knew, every Hebrew knew, that one couldn't claim to be a priest unless they were duly appointed by God. And in the Jewish realm, you had to be a descendant of Aaron. Now, anyone who attempted to be some kind of self-appointed high priest got themselves into trouble. If you go back and read into the Old Testament, you look at the stories of what happened, and you see what happens when people try to usurp the priestly authority, something bad was going to happen. You had 250 princes of Korah's family who decided that they had the right to be prophets and priests, just like Moses and Aaron, and the earth opened up and swallowed them all up. You can read that story in Numbers chapter 16 if you feel so inclined later on. Also, you see Aaron's wicked sons, Nadab and Abihu. They had their own problems. They took it on themselves to sacrifice in ways contrary to the way that God had described it. They decided they wanted to do it their own way. And when they had offered unauthorized fire on the altar, they ended up being consumed by authorized fire from God. And you can read about that in Leviticus chapter 10 at a later time. But you see, the Hebrews knew that the high priest had to be appointed by God. And why is it they had to be appointed by God? Well, because God said so. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 5 says this, "So also Christ glorified not himself to be made an high priest, but he that said unto him, Thou art my son, today have I begotten thee." It wasn't Christ that said, "I'm a high priest." It was God, the Father, that said, "That's my high priest. He's the one." But Christ is also something that sets him apart from any other high priest before him, is he's an eternal priest. Why is Jesus still our high priest today? Because God said so, and he is our high priest forever. Hebrews 5 and 6 says, "As he saith also in another place, Thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek." Now Melchizedek, we'll touch more on him when we get to chapter 7 later on in this study of Hebrews. But for now, let me just say a little bit about Melchizedek. He was the prince and the priest of Salem. He was a mysterious priest whose beginning and his end are really unknown. There is no real record of Melchizedek ever dying or ever being preceded by another priest. You know, see, and that's why they say in the order of Melchizedek. In the same way, Jesus is a priest forever. Jesus is the one constant thing in our lives when we live a life that's full of changes. We don't always like changes, but life is full of changes. And the only thing constant in our life is Jesus Christ. You know, I once heard about a little story about a lady who was devastated to hear that her preacher was leaving for another church. As she said goodbye to her former pastor, she began to cry, and the preacher tried to comfort her with these words, and he said to her, he said, "Don't be sad, dear sister. God will send you a new preacher, and he will be even better than the last one." Her reply was very swift and to the point when she said, "That's what they told me before you came, but it just keeps getting worse and worse." That's a good way to keep a preacher humble, isn't it? But the truth is, just about everybody has trouble with change. We don't really like change, but we have to realize that in this life, there's going to be change. And there's no guarantee that anybody is going to be around forever. You know, there comes times in our lives when we have to say goodbye to close friends. As parents, we eventually have to let our children go as they go out into the world and make a life for themselves. As children, we have to sometimes, it comes a time in our life when we have to say goodbye to our parents and let them go be with the Lord. And even sometimes when you look at the picture of Christ and the church is the picture of the groom and the bride. Even a husband and wife in this earth are only allowed to make a vow to each other until death do they part. Change is part of life. But Jesus is with us forever. Jesus was with us from the moment we were born. He's with us till the moment we die. And then he's with us beyond that too, through eternity. You know, just before his death, Jesus made this vow in John 14:18. He says, "I will not leave you comfortless. I will come to you." If you look up that word comfortless, you look up the Greek word that was used there, and it means I will not leave you without parent. You know, we think of, as a child, who is our comforter? It's our parent. And you look that Greek word up and it says, I will not leave you without parent. I won't leave you as an orphan. He is our eternal high priest, and he will never leave us. He's also an obedient priest. We see that in chapter 5, verses 7 and 8. It says there, who in the days of his flesh, when he had offered up prayers and supplications with strong crying and tears unto him that was able to save him from death, and was heard in that he feared, though he were a son, yet learned he obedience by the things which he suffered. We can only imagine that this is referring to Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's asking for deliverance. We see this supreme example of one who learned obedience through suffering. When you think about obedience, it's not always easy to be obedient. And it's never harder to be obedient than we're already suffering. And the temptation to disobey is never greater when we know that through obedience we will suffer even more. But you see, that's the situation that Jesus was facing in the garden when he prayed. You know, he prayed, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. But again he said, but not my will, but thine be done. Never make the mistake of thinking that Jesus did not want to obey. Jesus always wanted to obey. He was determined that he would obey his Father, but it's one thing to decide to obey and quite another thing to physically walk into the situation where you know you're going to be beaten, you're going to be tortured, you're going to be hung on a tree and put to death. Jesus was not only willing to obey, but he obeyed all the way to the cross when he could have at any time, through his own power, stopped it and made it go away. But he obeyed. We also have a perfect priest. Verse 9 goes on to explain this, where it says, and being made perfect, he became the author of eternal salvation unto all them that obey him. You see, when it says that he was made perfect here, that we have to understand that this doesn't mean that there was something wrong with him and he had to be made perfect. There wasn't anything that ever had to be fixed about Jesus Christ. Jesus lived a perfect life, and he is the perfect priest. Jesus was perfect before he ever stepped foot on this earth. Life on earth did not make him more perfect than he already was. The word perfect here, is a translation of the Greek word teleo, and that word means carrying something to completion, fulfilling a task completely. So the way made perfect is used here is not talking about fixing something that was wrong and making it better, but yet it was referring to Jesus being perfect in the completion of his supreme task. It was done. When Jesus offered up himself as the perfect sacrifice, then he completed God's salvation plan. That was God's plan from the day the foundations of the earth were laid. It was his plan for Christ to come die for us. Which, I was listening to the radio the other day, and one pastor got on and he was talking about, it's a question that a lot of people come up with. They say, if God already knew that Adam was going to fall, and sin was going to enter the world, and he was going to have to come and die for us, why didn't he stop it? Well, you know what? The Bible doesn't tell us that. We don't always understand everything there is to know about Jesus and God and his plan. We just know he created us so that we would have fellowship with him, and we're to love him and believe him. And that's it. But we see he's perfect. This plan was in place at the beginning of the world, and Jesus finished it. He accomplished what no other high priest was ever going to be able to do. The perfect priest, why is he the perfect priest? Because he offered himself up as the perfect sacrifice. So you see, Hebrews chapter 5 shows us Jesus. He shows him as our duly appointed, our sympathetic, our obedient, our eternal, and our perfect high priest. But what does that really mean to us today? That we have a appointed, sympathetic, obedient, eternal, and perfect high priest. How does that apply? Well, let me read again verse 16 out of chapter 4. It said, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we may attain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Because Jesus is our high priest, we never have to go to God alone. We can approach this throne of God with confidence because our high priest is there with us. You know, if you try and think of a modern day example of what this depicts, you really can't look too closely at the USA because we really don't have a king. The president doesn't really sit on any throne. The closest example to in our U.S. life would probably be those that come before a judge in a courtroom. You know, no one really wants to go in before the judge without legal representation. I don't know if you've ever seen or heard of a trial where the defendant decides they're going to serve as their own lawyer. It's usually just not a good idea. It's not a good picture. In court, you need an expert to mediate for you. And if you're really lucky, you'll get someone to represent you who has experience and knows what they're doing and has been there before and walked the path before and done everything and knows the judge and how the judge likes to work things. And hopefully you'll have someone who takes a genuine interest in your case and really cares about you. You see, that's what we have in Jesus. We have a representative who offers all of that and more. See, Jesus has experienced human life. He knows what it's like. He knows the steps that we walk. He knows how we feel. He knows how we think. And not only that, He cares deeply for you. And He wants what's best for you. And not only does He know the judge, but He's the judge's only begotten Son. And you see, He offers up His services to you for free. But it gets even better than that. You see, Jesus will do more than just represent you before God. God has declared that Jesus will also be the judge. Flip to John chapter 5 real quick. John chapter 5. In John chapter 5, verse 27, and hath given Him authority to execute judgment also, because He is the Son of Man. Execute the judgment. You know, imagine being a defendant in a criminal case. You approach the judge to get the final judgment, the final verdict, and he looks down from the bench at you and he says this. He says, I'll tell you what, I think your defense lawyer should make the judgment in this case. That's what Jesus does as our high priest. He's your representative, He's your counsel, He's your helper, and He's your friend, and in the end, He will be your judge. We just need to remember that He is the greatest high priest there ever will be, and there shall never be another, and there never needs to be another. And let us all just put our faith and trust in Him, and let Him be our priest and intercessor forever. Let's stand, let's be dismissed in a word of prayer.